A port city lying 20 miles outside of Rome, ancient Ostia is the nearest thing to a suburb of the Eternal City. The ruins at Ostia are not at all like the well-known cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The destruction of those small Roman towns was unexpected, swift, and complete. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius on August 14, 79 AD, froze those two cities at a moment in time. Distance allowed Ostia to escape the wrath of Vesuvius and continue to develop in the 2nd and 3rd centuries through the height of the dominance and power of the Roman Empire. Ostia shows us what Herculaneum and Pompeii could have been like had the powerful volcano not erupted. For almost 400 years, Ostia enjoyed growth and prosperity. Then, hand in hand with the fall of the Roman Empire, the city declined into 1,600 years of oblivion, abandoned, neglected, and largely forgotten. Nothing dramatic happened to destroy Ostia. It was never covered with lava or volcanic ash. What prompted Ostia's slow but steady decline? It began in the 4th century AD. The perpetrator was the Emperor Constantine I. When the barbarians invaded Ostia in 330 AD, Constantine's strategic response was to protect the harbor, leaving the town of Ostia vulnerable. The city was plundered, and it was never restored. Why was Ostia no longer valuable to the empire? The fall of Rome itself is the reason Ostia began to decline. Ostia, as the principal port city to the capital, was a very important economic force in the life of the empire. When Rome's position as the predominant world power eroded, Ostia was no longer deemed important. Traders and merchants could no longer make money and left the city. So when the roads and buildings began to collapse due to the invasions of the barbarians and to neglect, no one bothered to fix them. The city was slowly depopulated. A malaria infestation helped to speed up the process. By the Middle Ages, no one was left. Over the course of hundreds of years, silt from the Tiber River and debris from the Mediterranean Sea slowly engulfed the deserted town. In fact, where the Tiber once flowed right beside Ostia and emptied into the sea, today the coastline has moved because of all the silt buildup. Storms and earth movements also helped to compact the debris, turning it as hard as stone. The growth of Ostia was monumental. As the empire began to rise to the height of its glory, it is estimated that the population of ancient Rome exceeded 800,000. With that many people to feed, more food was needed than could be raised locally, or even in all of Italy. Therefore, the development of a port city was crucial to the economy of the empire. A place was needed to ship in the huge amounts of imported goods required to sustain the city. But there was a problem. Italy has very few natural ports. With the exception of Naples, which was too far from the capital, there were no other ports on the southwest coast of Italy. So the Romans took to building harbors. Ostia, being close to Rome and near the mouth of the Tiber, was an obvious choice. The Emperor Claudius undertook the project beginning in 42 AD. But his decision to go to Ostia to oversee construction of the port had devastating personal consequences. While Claudius was away on his mission, his wife Messalina became lonely and unhappy. She had a reputation as a nymphomaniac and soon found herself in a passionate love affair with an aristocrat. The pair did nothing to hide their desires. Against everyone's advice and the law, they married behind Claudius's back. Claudius' slaves, enraged by Messalina's actions and wanting to spare the emperor any further embarrassment, arranged for her execution. After his wife's death, Claudius married his niece. She was the mother of Nero. Eventually, Claudius' wife poisoned him in order to make way for her son to grab the reins of power. Unfortunately, the harbor designed by Claudius was about as successful as his marriages. It was an architectural disaster, Completed by Nero and just miles from Ostia, the port consisted of two long moles creating an enclosed harbor that faced towards the north. The problem was that the harbor was exposed to the fierce storms of the Mediterranean. At one point, a major calamity occurred that caused the loss of almost 200 ships. It took Nero's successor, Trajan, to finally get it right. He used the original Claudian harbor as a sort of forecourt to protect the entryway and built a large hexagonal internal harbor. This meant that much larger grain vessels coming from Africa and Egypt could be accommodated. The ships could be brought in, their content loaded to warehouses, then transferred to smaller barges and rafts, and towed up the Tiber to Rome. Viewing the ruins today, one of the things that stands out about the city is the shockingly large number of temples devoted to a mystery cult. The religion was known as Mithraism. There are 15 Mithraea that have been unearthed at Ostia. Due to its secret nature, no writings are available about the clandestine worshippers, but some details about the group have surfaced. It is believed that Mithraism was so popular in the area because it was a religion that appealed to foreigners and the military. It was a Persian cult, and it was believed to have been brought to Ostia by the Africans, Spanish, Gauls, and Syrians who flocked to the area. The congregation consisted of about 20 to 40 men who were dedicated to the worship of the pagan god Mithra. As the legend goes, Mithra was sent by the sun and born of a rock. He captured and later slaughtered a bull by holding its nostrils. In Eastern countries, it was common to sacrifice a bull in homage to Mithra, but by the time the cult reached Ostia, the killing of the bull was accomplished symbolically. In Ostia, part of the worship consisted of engaging in a sacrificial meal, instilling a sense of community and fellowship. But there was also another explanation for Mithraism's widespread appeal. Roman society was strictly ordered, and there was little movement from one social class to another. Mithraism offered an opportunity to better yourself despite the social rung to which you were born.
It's a cult where you are initiated, and then you go through a series of 7 grades from lowest to highest. And at the top, when you become the highest grade, a pater, you can actually go out and start your own congregation. Interestingly, like Christianity, the cult kind of trickles up through society. So it starts down with the more marginal characters, and by the 4th century, it's up with the senators. Some of these men are so enamored of the cult that they build a cult structure into their own houses. And we do have several examples from the city of Rome where that happens.
Literary sources and ancient inscription found in Rome stress that there were imperial prohibitions against foreign cults, mainly because they were thought to be politically subversive. Because of Mithraism's secret nature, it managed to escape the ban. The responsibility for the unearthing of Ostia falls mainly on the shoulders of one individual. Find out who that person was and what calculating plan motivated him to excavate the city. Coming up next. Why can we now see the evidence of the greatness of Ostia? Small-scale excavations had been conducted in Ostia beginning in the 1800s and had continued off and on until the early 1900s. This rudimentary work had revealed that Ostia was an extraordinarily modern-looking city.
This was really a great revelation to the people at the end of the 19th century, because they intended to think that all Roman towns of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD had looked like Pompeii and Herculaneum. That is, low 1- and 2-story buildings, the rich people living in great mansions with interior courtyards, and then a few scattered shops along the streets. And it turned out that that wasn't true at all.
But it took almost 4 decades from the time of these first discoveries to launch a dramatic campaign to excavate the ancient town. It was spearheaded by Italy's notorious dictator, Benito Mussolini. Why was Mussolini so interested in the ancient port? It was all part of a grand propaganda campaign for the new fascist Italy.
The chief elements of his propaganda was to connect the grandeur of ancient Rome with the glory of his new regime. This meant a great deal of excavation and archaeological investigation all throughout the city of Rome.
But beginning in 1937 and continuing through 1942, Mussolini instituted one of his grandest plans, which revolved around Ostia. Mussolini and his archaeologists were determined to quickly uncover the hidden greatness of the ancient seaport and to make it into a showplace for a world exposition scheduled to take place in Rome in 1942. The event was to be a celebration of the 20th anniversary of fascism. But this plan was thwarted by the arrival of World War II. The International Exposition was canceled. Yet during this 5-year period, fully 1/3 of Ostia was excavated. On the one hand, Mussolini's excavation of the site was an archaeological disaster. Excavations were carried out quickly with giant earth movers, destroying fragile relics. Also, so few records were kept of the work that a great deal of important information was lost. On the other hand, no one else would have had the resources or the gall to excavate such an enormous amount of territory. The work of Mussolini and company has provided for us the ancient city that we now see. Ostia is a very unusual place, chiefly because it was an international town, teeming with people of all classes, nationalities, and cultures. It is also unusual because what remains of the city shows us how people lived during ancient times. Everything from temples to baths, from bar rooms to luxury homes and to apartments.
The apartments of Ostia are very unusual. In Ostia, as in Rome, city land became so valuable and the population grew so rapidly that they began building up. And though there are some signs of this in Pompeii just before the great destruction of AD 79, and there are some apartment houses left in Rome, but they're hard to see and study, it is Ostia where we go to see the 3, 4, and even 5-story apartment house, as we would call it.
These large, plain brick buildings were simple and natural. There were no classical adornments, no ornate columns or marble carvings. The Emperor Augustus boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But at Ostia, the use of brick is maintained, chiefly as a facade. The walls were actually made of concrete to protect the town from the threat of fire. The apartments consisted of multiple units, some with as many as 7 rooms. Usually, the building contained a courtyard with staircases going up to the upper floors. Most of the buildings had small shops on the bottom floor, a place to buy olive oil, a bakery, a shop for wine, a bar, a restaurant, and so forth. And unlike other Roman towns, Ostia provides us with a glimpse of how the middle class lived. Port officials, shopkeepers, and the people who managed the city's commerce.
This is one called the Apartment of the Yellow Walls. One would come in through the vestibule behind me and into this living room, lit by 3 large windows which give on to a lovely garden outside. The house had, like its name suggests, yellow walls mixed with red, and even the bedrooms in the interior, which are rather dark, lit only from the windows in front, have walls covered with yellow and red paintings. These big living rooms took the place of the atrium of earlier Roman houses. From it, we can move into the dining room, called a triclinium, where the couches for banquets would have been found.
It is a large and attractive room with elaborate painting and a particularly intricate black and white mosaic. A smaller room gives off it, perhaps for more intimate family dinners, or perhaps as a place used by the servants to pass food in and out. Again, its walls are red and yellow with these rather elaborate fake architecture pilasters running around the room. What we are missing in this house are the service rooms. We have no kitchens, bathrooms, servants' quarters, and there do not seem to be enough bedrooms. The lack of service areas in the apartment buildings, particularly kitchens, is commonplace and perplexing to the scholars who have studied the region. Why are these rooms missing in Ostia? One explanation could be that activities which normally take place in the privacy of our homes, like eating and bathing, were public activities in the ancient Roman world. So it is reasonable to think that the people of Ostia did not eat most meals at home, but rather at the neighborhood restaurant. One of the most famous shopping areas is called the Thermopolium in the House of Diana apartment complex. The restaurant in the complex, with its marble countertops and wide open areas, can still be easily seen.
Clearly, a lot of the open shops along the principal roads must have been used for food and drink. And a lot of the smaller apartments, which would have been the lost upper floors of the buildings, the people there must have come down and simply had their meals in the local bars and restaurants.
Many also believe that the absence of everyday spaces in the apartments is due to a lack of interest on the part of excavators of the early 20th century. Those archaeologists were far more interested in the luxurious side of life, unearthing fine apartments, mosaic floors, and delicate paintings and inscriptions. Recently, Janet Delane, an archaeology expert from the University of Reading in England, set her sights on finding a kitchen. While working on the site of an apartment building, Janet and her team of students were thrilled to have met their objective.
There are only really 2 kitchens at Ostia which have been clearly identified, both in the same apartment block. So it's quite rare to find one, to be able to identify one as easily as this. And hopefully this will encourage a study of other rooms which have been partly excavated and filled in and then ignored.
Just as in Pompeii and Herculaneum, a great deal of attention has been paid to the homes of the wealthy people who lived in Ostia. One such home is known as the House of Cupid and Psyche. It was given this name because a sculpture of these gods was recovered when the house was first excavated. This elegant residence was built in the 4th century, about 200 years after the House of the Yellow Walls.
We're coming in through the door and through this vestibule with seats for the clients or servants of the house, and into the most glamorous room in Ostia. It's a large hallway, really, and it gives onto an open garden with this extraordinary fountain. It may seem curious to find a fountain this large inside what is in fact a very small house, but rich people then, as now, could afford to waste space. From this large hall, we move into the only grand reception room in the house. It's again probably a banqueting room.
It's floored with a beautiful and costly mosaic made out of yellow marble imported from Africa and rose-pink marble and porphyry possibly cut from columns of some public building. Once, porphyry was only used for emperors, but now it could be found in some of these marble floors. The walls are paneled with pale gray and white marble with red borders, a very deep red, suggestive of a senator's toga. Who was the owner of the house? This remains a mystery, but the small size and outstanding luxury has led to much speculation about the proprietor. Many believe that this was the home of an important Roman senator who made frequent trips to Ostia and needed a place to conduct business and entertain clients. Whether you were a wealthy senator or a dock worker, the communal baths were an integral part of daily life. But a lot more went on at the baths than bathing. Like Like all the people of Rome, the inhabitants of Ostia were obsessed with feeling good and clean. And to this end, the baths were an important part of everyday life. Since homes and apartments lacked running water, washing and grooming was done at one of the vast number of public baths. With the latest excavations, 18 neighborhood baths have been located throughout the city. This is a startlingly high number, considering the population of Ostia at its greatest is estimated to be about 30,000 people. On a typical day in ancient Ostia, the ringing of bells would announce the noon hour. Then people of all classes would retire to the baths. Nobody was denied entry to the baths, not even slaves. Originally, men and women bathed together, but near the beginning of the 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian banned co-ed bathing, so men and women used the baths at different hours. The ancient baths are equivalent to our modern-day health clubs. The most luxurious baths the town ever enjoyed were called the Baths of Neptune. Frequented by soldiers, firemen, and merchants who worked nearby, the Baths of Neptune featured a large, finely decorated area that was used as a gymnasium. Completely naked so their movement would not be restricted, the men engaged in sports such as discus, the javelin, and boxing. After their workout, the men would refresh themselves in cold water pools called frigidaria. Then they would soak in pools of warm water called colidaria. The colidaria were heated by wood-burning furnaces placed directly beneath the floors. There were rooms for resting and rooms with giant steam baths. Massages and body hair waxing were commonplace rituals.
Imagine all the sounds coming from the baths right into my ears. People singing, reading verse, getting massaged. And those getting waxed won't stay quiet even for a minute. Excerpt from a letter written by the philosopher Seneca from his apartment above the baths.
Rich or poor, young or old, male or female, everyone came to the baths. Likewise, everyone went to the theater. Built in 12 AD, this beautiful and imposing structure provided the space for entertainment for the people of Ostia. This theater was commissioned by Agrippa, who was the son-in-law of the Emperor Augustus. It was originally built to seat 3,000 people. What does this reveal to us about Ostia? The number of seats gives us some idea of the size of the town at that time, approximately 25,000 people at the start of the 2nd century.
And its importance in the life of the town is very obvious from the fact that it was continuously being rebuilt under Claudius, under Commodus at the end of the 2nd century, and finally at the end of the 4th century when it was used for water spectacles. These featured nymphs, nereids, and in what was meant to be a very Christian era were probably very pagan events. The theater was probably also used, apart from for plays, it was used for variety shows.
Because restorations have continued to take place to the present day, the theater is still being used. Professional actors and singers still take the stage at Ostia, as well as visitors to the area who, inspired by the grandeur of the theater, perform as so many have through the centuries. In antiquity, the actors were all men. They played the women's part as well as the male roles. This did not pose a big problem since the performers used masks. These masks represented emotions like fear or sadness, and the actors changed them according to which feeling they wanted to express.
The orchestra would have played in this grassy green space in front of me, once covered with white marble, and I'm standing on the edge of the stage. You can see the very elegant series of rectangular and semicircular niches. Naturally, the stage would have been flat back to those columns and covering these retaining walls that we can see today. The columns mark the edge of a permanent backdrop, the Skyne of Franz, which would have served as the backdrop for all manner of spectacles.
When the shows ended, many men visited the local tavern to share a bottle of wine, or they went to a restaurant to have a light meal. These shops were often housed beneath the apartment buildings. Though entertainment was readily available to the citizenry, business was the business of Ostia. The potential to make money brought people from all over the ancient world to this area. What remarkable evidence of Ostia's importance did these merchants and traders leave behind? 117 AD was one of the most important years in the history of Ostia. It was in this year that the Emperor Hadrian came to power. Hadrian was responsible for transforming the town from a Roman military outpost to a cosmopolitan city. During Hadrian's 21-year reign, half of the city of Ostia was built or renovated. An amateur architect, Hadrian was responsible for the building of the wall that bears his name, the glorious Pantheon of Rome, and many other places throughout the empire. But Ostia was his special pet project.
He took a great interest in the city. Those luxury apartments that exist there are of Hadrian's time. So they're commercial buildings, they're religious buildings, and they're social buildings. And the great temple, which stands in its core almost complete by the Forum, is also by Hadrian. He really stamped the town.
Hadrian's development plans for Ostia were enormous. The work of actually building the buildings was performed by both free men and slaves. By the 2nd century, the use of slave labor was waning, mainly because the cost to keep them had become prohibitive. And the idea of working with people as opposed to owning them was an idea that appealed to the Roman sense of logic.
Of course, it was easier to control people by cooperation than by brute force, and Rome took an incredibly pragmatic view of the far-flung cultures that it controlled.
By virtue of trade and commerce, Ostia was a true multicultural city. Nowhere is this better represented than in the piazza of the corporations. The piazza was a grand and impressive space covered by a large double colonnaded portico. It was located directly behind the theater. The piazza served a dual purpose. Between acts of a show, people would stroll through the piazza, or they could take cover there if a sudden rainstorm forced them indoors. It also served as an office building for the many companies that did business in Ostia. But the most impressive thing that can still be seen in the piazza today are the beautiful mosaics. What do these intricate works of art reveal to us? The relationship between Ostia and its port was clearly defined by these mosaics. All of the mosaics were done in black and white tile, and some were put up at different times. They were contributed to the city by the merchants and the shipbuilders that worked here in the port.
And they show us the major objects of the commerce that came into Ostia, and from Ostia was shipped up to the enormous city of Rome. Among them we find amphorae from Mauritania in North Africa. We find animals for the circuses, like the elephants at the north end of the portico. And we find pictures of the ships that carried them. We find pictures of the lighthouses and mosaics showing ports on the far-flung edges of the empire.
What was the purpose of these elaborate designs? Some historians believe the mosaics were intended as advertisements to be seen by the people who attended productions at the theater. Others think the mosaics might have in some way indicated a corporate sponsorship of the theater. Whatever its true purpose, this piazza was the only one of its kind in the Roman Empire. Viewing the ruins today, one of the things that stands out about the city is the enormous number of warehouses called horea. These storage spaces housed essential goods between the time they arrived in the port and were shipped to the capital. This one was called the Horea of Epagathena. Like most of the buildings in Ostia, it was constructed of plain bricks. But those bricks were used in an architecturally imaginative and decorative way. Though very well preserved, questions about the buildings still confound experts.
We don't always know at Ostia whether the facades would have been left in plain brick or whether there would have been a covering of stucco to hide the bare bones of the brickwork. However, this craftsmanship is so well done that I'm tempted to believe that it was intended to be seen. And the combination of applied decoration, of cornices, of projecting balconies, all work together to create a harmonious, unified whole and a very elegant facade for a very utilitarian, very workaday building.
Remains of most of the warehouses and much of the port can still be seen today.
The one thing we're missing is the actual unloading zones that must be lying there just beyond that bank in what was once the Tiber port, which has now been filled in and is no longer visible. This, in fact, is probably Ostia's mystery. Where did they unload? Where were the docks? We know where the warehouses were. We know where the houses were. But we haven't exactly the idea of where the sort of docks and lighthouses which we see on the mosaics would have been found.
Most historians and archaeologists believe the remains of the docks and almost one-third of Ostia still remain buried. But it is unlikely those unseen ruins will ever be revealed. They are hidden under the Fiumicino airport, and it is doubtful the Italian government would ever choose to dig up this area. Trade was the lifeblood of the city. With so many sailors and merchants living in this harbor town, it would be logical to guess that prostitution would have been big business in Ostia. Yet, surprisingly, there's extremely little evidence of it. No building clearly designed as a brothel, such as were found in Pompeii, has been identified. But it would be naive to conclude that Ostia had higher moral standards than other towns of the day. It is more likely that the brothel still remains to be found. But evidence of the importance of religious worship in the life of the people of Ostia can still easily be seen. While the mystery cult Mithraism was very popular, the Roman religion was the dominant form of worship, and there were many ornate temples. The Emperor Hadrian commissioned a state temple to Jupiter, the chief god of Rome, on the site of the Forum at Ostia. It was also possible to find a synagogue in Ostia, and by around 350 AD, a Christian church.
The Romans were interested in the peace of the gods, in the general agreement of all possible imaginable gods. And the only thing they couldn't stand was exclusivity. This, of course, was the major problem with the Jews and the Christians, whose single god excluded all the others and didn't fit in with the idea that all gods, like all peoples, could be made to cooperate for the empire.
But the people of Ostia did not fully escape religious persecution. Christianity gained a foothold during the 4th century, fueled by reported miracles and executions. A jailed Roman official who had embraced Christianity was visited in prison by a priest. After the visit, the official's chains miraculously loosened. The soldiers on guard, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed, immediately converted to Christianity and were baptized. News of this wondrous event, along with a story that a dead boy was brought back to life, reached Rome. Angry officials were sent to Ostia to investigate. When they refused to renounce their faith, the soldiers, the jailed official, and 3 others were put to death. In Ostia, as in Rome itself, the dead were buried outside of town. The burial area was known as Isola Sacra, or Sacred Island. This necropolis is a unique example of a necropolis of the Roman imperial age. The necropolis was used by the people of Ostia, rich and poor, for almost 250 years. Most often the people would be buried in urns called amphora that were buried directly in the earth. Other tombs were more elaborate, with multiple chambers, bas-reliefs, ornate paintings, and mosaics. What else does this necropolis reveal to us? By examining the tombs, scholars have discovered that two different funeral rites were performed in Ostia. The most simple was direct burial. The body was either placed directly in the ground or placed in a tomb. Some tombs resembled coffins, others looked like truncated pyramids. But the most common practice was cremation, with the ashes being placed in a chamber. Some chambers were simple, while others were large and elaborate. The reliefs and inscriptions on the tombs give us a bit of insight about the people who lived in Ostia. For example, this relief depicts a scene of a baby being delivered by a midwife. This scene shows a surgeon performing an operation. Hundreds of reliefs and inscriptions like these show us that Ostia was at one time a busy, thriving town. But like the rest of the ancient port city, the necropolis was buried by silt and debris. It was unearthed during Mussolini's great excavation period. Over 200 tombs have been discovered, yet they are but a few that experts believe still remain to be found in this necropolis. Over about 300 years, a historically short period of time, Ostia went from a rich and powerful port to a neglected, abandoned wasteland. What can modern society learn from what happened at Ostia? While Rome enjoyed its status as the head of the world, the conquering of such vast and far-off territories had dire consequences for the empire. And as the tides turned against Rome, the good fortune of Ostia turned as well. By the 3rd century AD, weak leadership and invasions by Germanic tribes combined to create a state of anarchy in the capital. The Emperor Diocletian secured control of the fragmented empire in 284 AD. He established order and divided the empire into two distinct halves, Eastern and Western, each with its own ruler. Diocletian's successor was the Emperor Constantine. But Constantine was forced to seize the reins of power. His rival, Maxentius, had declared himself emperor, controlling Italy and Africa. Fighting for his rightful claim, Constantine saw a huge cross in the wartime sky and received what he claimed was a message from God. Combining military strategy and spiritual conversion, Constantine defeated Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome on October 28, 312 AD. 3 years later, Constantine declared Christianity the state religion. Within 9 years, Constantine seized control of the eastern half of the empire. He then hastened the end of Rome's supremacy by moving the capital east to the city he named Constantinople, now called Istanbul.
Finally, Portus becomes the official port of Rome under Constantine. And that is really the death knell for Ostia in commercial or economic terms. It is no longer even officially or formally known as the Port of Rome. And for that reason, it no longer has the economic activity, and so it no longer can support such a population. At this time, the population in Rome was beginning to decline as well. So the falling off is gradual, but it is quite definite and unstoppable once the decline has set in.
Huge armies of barbarian mercenaries broke through neglected fortifications along Rome's northern borders and descended on the city. In 410 AD, Rome was sacked for the first time, and the pillaging of the once mighty empire continued on and off for over 120 years.
As long as Rome continued as a flourishing imperial power, Ostia, in its shadow, as the principal port city to the capital, was a very important economic force. in the life of the empire. When Rome began to decline, the fortunes of Ostia fell in tandem with it, so that by the early Middle Ages, the site is abandoned.
Unlike Pompeii, Ostia ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The town enjoyed a brief renaissance at the end of the 3rd century. It became a beach community and playground for the wealthy, but Ostia's revitalization was short-lived. Threats of invasion and actual attacks forced the populace to flee.
The population moved out, and then no one else lived on the site for, well, really right up to modern times. There was a modern settlement, but it was further off towards the north and the east, and the core of the ancient city remained largely untouched. And Rome must have looked exactly like Ostia at a certain period, these great endless blocks of flats and huge public buildings all left by themselves. The difference was that people moved back into Rome and began to reuse these buildings and change them and added onto them and built over them. And so all of that was changed and altered beyond recognition in Rome, whereas that never happened in Ostia.
By the Middle Ages, the story of Ostia had come full circle. The thriving imperial harbor had once again become silted up and was no longer in use. At great risk, ships entered the port at the mouth of the Tiber and traveled upstream to Rome. By the 12th century, just a handful of people remained in the city. 300 years later, a revival of the area was sparked by the church. The Pope sought to exploit Ostia's rich soil and salt beds, but this renaissance was thwarted by a malaria infestation. The ancient city of Ostia remained abandoned and essentially forgotten until the 1800s, when scholars and archaeologists began to excavate the town. It took the ambitious and calculating plans of Mussolini to restore Ostia's place of importance in the history of Imperial Rome. Ostia is not another Pompeii. The two towns differ radically in history and character. Pompeii was a busy provincial town of prosperous people who made comfortable livings from agricultural and small-scale industry. Ostia was far more important to Rome. As the empire's harbor town, Ostia demanded the attention of Roman authorities. Sensitive to the danger of famine, emperors could not afford to neglect the port. As Rome grew and prospered, so did Ostia. And as ancient Rome died, she buried her port with her.
In the early 16th century, a small group of nomads crossed the border from Afghanistan into India. Only 20 years later, they founded one of the most powerful empires in human history. Where did the Mughals get their strength from? The whole story about the empire of Genghis Khan's descendants. Monday night at 8 on History International.